and welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Yosha Ganasekera, your host for this afternoon. Now, on Law and Crime Rewind, we're talking about a case that captivated the nation. It's the Jessica Chambers trial. Now, if you were following it here on Law and Crime from gavel to gavel, stay with us because we're going to cover the highlights of the case along with some fresh legal analysis. As you can see, we have a jam-packed afternoon, including the Chris Watts sentencing as well. But the Jessica Chambers trial was a truly disturbing one in which 19-year-old Jessica Chambers was literally found burning alive. She tragically died the very next day. But there was no suspect in this case until over a year later, and that man was Quinton Tellis. Now, incredibly, Quinton Tellis still has not been found guilty after 2 trials. You heard that correctly. There's been 2 mistrials in this case. And so that leaves a lot of legal questions. Will there be a 3rd trial? Will there ever be justice for Jessica Chambers? We'll see where this case all began with the prosecutor's opening statement. Let's take a look.
What I expect you to hear in this case. What I'm going to tell you about is a horrendous event that happened on December the 6th of 2014. I want to tell you about the involvement of this case and the involvement of the investigation. This case began on December 6, 2014, when first responders responded to a car fire on Heron Road located here in Panola County. They responded as a routine car fire. When the first responders arrived at the fire, they got out, they saw the car on fire, they went to work. Not as soon as the first one got out, you're going to hear Seth Cook, when he got out, he sees something coming in the distance. I'm going to let them describe to you what they saw. It immediately startled the first 2 there. They back out, pull down the road just to assess, see what's going on. You're going to go to Heron Road. You're going to visit this area. You're going to see that this is not the city of Batesville. This is not the city of Starkville. There's no street lights. This is out in the middle of the country. It's dark. It's loud. You're going to hear these first responders testify that when they realized that they were dealing with a human being, they approached her. 2 of the officers went to fight the fire. The other officer, Cole Haley, will tell you that he actually approached Jessica. I'm going to let Cole describe to you Jessica's condition. I'm going to let Cole describe to you the scene that night. Cole's also going to describe to you that certainly they sent out for help. Shortly thereafter, Daniel Cole arrives. Daniel Cole is the director of the emergency operations here in Panola County. He is the chief fire officer for the county. Daniel Cole actually lived in the area. He was able to respond very quickly. Daniel Cole is also going to testify and describe to you the condition of Jessica. He's going to describe to you the noise on the scene, the temperament there on the scene from all the fire officers. He is going to talk to you about what she looked like. Some of this is going to be very graphic. You're going to see some photographs of what she looked like there on the scene. Quinton Tellis' phone that evening was hitting on was in the same area as Jessica's phone. And the ironic part about it is it was in Batesville. You're going to hear this area where they live is in Cortland. It's 6 or 7 miles away. When Paul went back to look at the data, the one thing we knew that we had knowns, and you're going to hear a lot about the word knowns. Knowns are facts. Those are things that do not change. Those are things that we can tell you this is fact. We knew the knowns on Jessica's timeline, where she was throughout the day. When we got that location data back, that's when we knew that Quinton Tellis was in the same area as Jessica. At that point, Quinton Tellis needed to be talked to again. In November of 2015, investigators found Quinton Tellis in Monroe, Louisiana. They traveled to Monroe, Louisiana to interview Quinton Tellis. During that interview, Quinton was confronted to the fact that, hey, we got your location data now. Your phones are together here in Batesville. And then Quinton remembered, oh, yeah, I did see her. I went up to Taco Bell and met her. Taco Bell right here in the middle of town. You passed it on 6 yesterday. But he tells them that he was in Big Mike's truck. Big Mike Sanford. You're going to hear Big Mike Sanford's name. He says he was in Big Mike's truck. He met her there. He got out, went through the drive-through, and then got back in Big Mike's truck, and they both went back in their own vehicles to Cortland. So he separated himself with her. This is around 6:30. Jessica Chambers moved to the crime scene at 7:30.
And that was part of the prosecutor's opening statement, really not making an argument, but previewing the argument to come. And now I have two very special Law&Crime guests with us, Judge Wilcott and Jennifer Schuster. Thank you so much for being here today and providing legal analysis on this. Judge Wilcott, I want to go to you first. Given what we know with this trial, given that we know the prosecutor could not secure a conviction here, what were your thoughts on the opening statement? Again, it's not argument, but did you think it was effective preview of what was to come?
I think it was an accurate preview of what he's going to present with the evidence. The thing that I noted was interesting to me, it is a horrific crime. She literally, as you already pointed out, was burned alive, and she walked towards the first responders. He didn't touch on any of those details other than to say, I'm going to let those witnesses tell you what they saw. It is so horrific that it may have been something that if he had said, this is what they're going to tell you, it might capture the jury more. But that's hindsight. I just don't know for sure.
And Jennifer, what were your thoughts on this opening statement, especially when the prosecutor is going after Quinton Tellis's inconsistencies? Do you think that was effective?
Sure, that's absolutely going to be a focal point in the prosecution's case. But obviously, the biggest challenge that the state faces here is the fact that Jessica uttered a dying declaration and said those words, Eric and Derek did this to me. That, no doubt, is a massive challenge that they didn't overcome in the first trial, and that's going to be a difficult task for them to face in this trial. And I think the prosecutor was smart in mentioning that up front, saying that we've got this issue that we've got to address, and then he moved on to things like the cell phone records and also Quinton's inconsistent statements, like you said.
Yes, and viewers will recall that there was a dying statement by Jessica. She did say that Derek or Eric did this to her. That is a first responder's testimony. That's the defense's testimony. That is what was partially came out through the first responders, but the prosecution is, of course, refuting that. And my question is, Judge Wilcott, do you think that they came out strong enough in the opening, or do you think that that should have been something solely reserved for their closing about the Derek Eric statement?
Right. No, I agree with Jennifer. I think the prosecution is absolutely doing the right thing by mentioning it, not focusing on it, but saying, hey, we're going to deal with this in the trial so that it doesn't look like, oh, they were trying to hide that and cover it up. So I think they did the exact right thing by putting it out there at the very front.
I agree. Now we're going to throw to the defense opening statement, seeing how they're going to rebut some of the argument that the prosecution is making. Let's take a look.
December 6, 2014. It was a Saturday, and I can't believe that it's really been almost 4 years now. This year, December, it'll be 4 years. A young woman was indeed killed, and Lord knows my heart has been burdened by this myself. Yet minutes after Miss Jessica was seen by the first firefighters and the emergency personnel that was on the scene that evening, what Miss Jessica did was she walked and she talked. And I'll say that again. One of the firefighters saw her coming towards him, towards two of them. She walked and she talked that evening. Now, that would be something that you would not expect that a person and her condition would do. But that's what she did that evening. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the state has just told you a long story about what they feel happened on that Saturday 4 years ago. Yet, to this day, we still do not know what really happened to her. They can't prove it. There's no evidence to support it. It's all speculation. But what we do know is that minutes after Miss Jessica walked towards trained people who could help her, she talked to trained people who were standing and kneeling as close to her, even closer than what I am to you now. And she told these first responders one name, and that name was Eric. Now, unlike what the district attorney's office has just told you, the evidence will show that law enforcement did not check every viable lead on finding who Eric was. And as he stated to you, once it dried up for them, instead of continuing to look for the person who Jessica said did this to her.
And that was part of the defense's opening statement. Now, Jessica, again, we're focusing on this Eric Derrick statement and the fact that she's walking about, that she's able to talk. Do you think that the defense got their point across here?
Oh, sure, and that's the crux of their defense here. I mean, that's going to be a very difficult thing for the jury to consider. The fact that Jessica herself uttered these words as a dying declaration. So I think the defense did an effective job, driving that point home. I think it'll be interesting to see what the evidence shows in terms of the defense arguing that the Derrick and Eric leads weren't completely run down to the ground. And the prosecution, of course, is going to say, well, yeah, we checked out every Eric and Derrick far and wide, and we ruled them out as suspects.
And that's a great point, because what does it mean to check out the Eric and Derrick suspect? Are they doing the DNA swabs? Are they going the extra mile to truly rule out any acquaintances of Jessica Chambers with that name? We have more testimony upcoming, and it's going to be really heartbreaking testimony, that of Jessica Chambers' mother. Mrs. Chambers is going to discuss the last hours of her daughter's life, setting up essentially a timeline. We're going to hear more from her after this break. Stay tuned. What you're hearing is testimony from Lisa Chambers, Jessica's mother, about the last phone conversation and communication they ever had. Let's listen to more.
Now, before you woke up at 10 o'clock, you had no idea where she had been. Is that correct?
Well, she was in her bed when I went to bed. Now I don't know where she was that morning.
Okay.
Claimed she went to work, but now I don't know.
Okay. So at least before you woke up, you just don't know where she went? No, ma'am?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And I believe the next time you heard from her was what time?
It's about 6:48.
Is there, you ask it this way, is there a reason you remember the exact time?
Because Mr. Held just told me the exact time,
Yes.
but I do have it on my phone, so
You do?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. And pretty brief conversation that you had with
Yes,
her?
ma'am, pretty much. Yeah.
Pretty short?
Mhm.
And over her cell phone, correct?
Correct.
How long would you say the phone call was?
I have no idea.
Okay. And I believe you testified that she said she was going to get something to eat. Did she say that in the phone call?
Yeah.
Okay. At 5:15 when she left, again, 5:15 or so, did she indicate to you where she was going then?
Same thing, going to get something to eat.
She was going to get something
Going
else
to clean
eat?
out my car, and I'll be back in a little bit.
Okay. Course indulgence, just momentarily. And then one last question for you. During that phone call that you had with Miss Jessica, you couldn't tell if there was anyone else in the car with her?
Did I hear anyone?
Right. Did
No.
you hear anyone? Okay.
No.
And so basically you don't know if anyone was in the car with her or not?
No.
Okay. Thank you. I attended the witness show.
And that's more of Lisa Chambers' testimony about her last moments with her daughter. Now, Jennifer, I want to talk a little bit about this testimony. Here, obviously, this is a very sympathetic woman. Do you think that the testimony here is more to prove Quinton Tellis guilty? Do you think it's laying out a timeline really effectively? Or do you think it's the prosecution's intent here is to garner sympathy for the victim and for her family?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, Yosho. I think that, her primary purpose here is to tell us who Jessica was and really bring her to life. I think it's interesting that the prosecutor refers to her as a girl, as a kid, a child even. I heard that in the opening statement. So I think, and then showing that picture, it looks like she's in her bedroom with the pink walls, just a regular kid taking a selfie. So I think that's really what the goal here is with the mom. This isn't where either side is going to win or lose their case, not with this witness.
Yes, I agree. It's hard to tell exactly where they're going with this direct examination. Judge Wilcott, what do you make of these questions about the phone call and the conversation and how there's no noise or sound in the background? What is the importance of this testimony?
Well, I think they're still looking at the fact that first responders testified that she said, she being the one who was burned, either Derek or Eric to the first responders. So what they're trying to say is, listen, no one was there. There was no background noise. So there was no Derek or Eric around that did this. I think they're trying to eliminate any confusion by the jury or the jury trying to say Derek or Eric did it, not this defendant.
I think that's a great point, Judge Wilcott. So next, after this break, we're going to hear more testimony. And this is going to be the testimony we're all talking about the first responders and what Jessica may or may not have said when she was walking out of that burning car. Stay tuned. We'll have more for you after this short break. So that was testimony from Sandra Haley, who also heard a Derek Eric being uttered out of Jessica Chambers' lips. It wasn't just a one-off. And in fact, we have yet another person who testifies to things that he heard Jessica Chambers say that day before she died. Let's take a look.
Did you ever get out at the scene where the car was?
I don't think I did, no.
Okay. And where was the landing zone in relation to the scene where Jessica was burned?
It was approximately a mile back down on Main Street, which Heron Road turns into Main Street, right there in the church parking lot by the railroad tracks.
Did you know Jessica?
Yes.
I believe her father worked with y'all at that time. Is that
Yes.
correct? And I believe what was Ben's responsibility with?
He was a mechanic at the sheriff's department.
Okay. Did you recognize, or did you go into the ambulance?
I did.
And did you recognize her?
Yes.
What was her condition?
She was basically burnt from head to toe, hair singed, skin hanging everywhere. It was pretty bad.
You ever seen anything like that?
Not while they're still alive, no.
Did you and Darryl talk to Jessica?
Yes, we did.
And what did you ask her?
I asked her who did this, and she responded what sounded like Eric.
Now, was she speaking like you and I are talking right now?
No, not at all.
Well, describe for the jury how she was talking.
It was real low and mumbled. And I asked her, I said, Eric who? And she said, no. And I said, you don't know? No. But, I don't know if she was saying no, not Eric, or no, she didn't know Eric's last name. But she was saying no.
And did you ask her the color of the person who had done this?
Later, right as I was talking to her, my phone rang, and it was the sheriff. So I got out of the ambulance to speak with the sheriff, and he was en route there. And the sheriff asked me if he was black or white, and I told her, I said, I'll find out. So I got back in the ambulance, and I asked her, I said, Jessica, was he black or white? And she said black.
So we're hearing more testimony of what was said by Jessica Chambers those last few moments. Now, Judge Wilcott, I want to go to you. How convincing do you think those, especially those two first responders, were? Do you think this case is dead in the water for the prosecution, given how clearly it seems they heard Jessica Chambers say the name Eric or Derek?
The only reason I don't think it's dead in the water, so to speak, is because the very first responder, the first of these four witnesses, said, she said, somebody set me on fire. Now take that in conjunction with this most recent fourth witness who said, when he asked about Eric, she said no, and he didn't know if that meant she didn't know the last name, if it wasn't Eric. So there are pieces of the testimony indicating she didn't, in fact, mean that Eric, quote unquote, killed her, or set her on fire, I should say.
And Jennifer, I want to go to you. It seems pretty clear based on the testimony of these first responders that she is able to talk. Sure, her words may be slurred. She may be saying Chambers instead of Chambers, but it seems like she's able to speak. We're going to later hear testimony from the prosecution where they contend she wasn't able to speak at all. How do you think the prosecution and the jurors can reconcile that pretty huge discrepancy?
Well, we'll have to wait and hear what that expert has to say. But I think that this testimony isn't especially damaging for the prosecution because all of these witnesses said she was speaking, but they all said she wasn't speaking clearly. We have one witness saying that she had to bend down to hear her, another saying that she was out of breath and she was speaking with a lot of air in her voice, and then that fourth witness, like Judge Wilcott said, the fact that he said Jessica then said no after she said Eric or Derek, I mean, that's compelling stuff. And so I think really the prosecution did an effective job in presenting these witnesses and their weaknesses.
Yes, definitely. It seems that she was struggling to speak, and this is really the crux of the case. And so after the break, we're going to hear from the prosecution's witness, a doctor who's going to testify that Jessica Chambers might not have been able to speak at all. We'll hear more from him after this break. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We're covering the Jessica Chambers murder trial, where 19-year-old Jessica Chambers was burned alive. Now, we've all been listening to testimony by the first responders on what Jessica Chambers had been saying moments before her death, whether she was actually able to name her killer, and how accurate she may have been given the severe burns that she was suffering. Let's take a listen as to the expert. The prosecution called an expert speech pathologist, who discussed whether Jessica was even able to speak given the severity of her burns. Let's hear what she has to say.
The last thing I want to get to before I ask what your opinion is, were you advised of the condition of Jessica Chambers' tongue?
Yes, from the video when Dr. Hickerson described it.
Okay. And was it described to you as being swollen?
Yes.
Okay. What role does the tongue play in making an articulate sound?
The tongue is crucial in making individual sounds. Like I said a minute ago, it is fastest moving muscle and the one that requires the most preciseness in making individual sounds. So if you have no tongue, and some people lose their tongue for various reasons, cancer or whatever, then you don't have the ability to make individual sounds that are going to form words.
And if a tongue is swollen, or do tongues swell because of fire inhalation?
I think that's a medical decision. Have I seen tongues that were swollen after burns? Yes. My expert opinion, based on everything that I reviewed and my professional experience, is that given the severity of what I saw, it would be impossible for this person to make individual sounds in any way. From what I viewed, in my expert opinion, the severity of what I saw would have prohibited this person from producing any kind of an articulate sound.
For what time period?
From very soon after the trauma, like within minutes after the trauma.
Within minutes after the trauma. Okay. So that would be based upon what?
The severity of the burns and the pictures I saw of the vocal folds and the Dr. Hickerson's report of what was apparent when she did arrive at the med, as well as relating back to what went on during transportation to the med. Again, I've been at this a long time.
Sure.
There's no way this person produced an articulate sound from very soon after this inflammation started or this burn started.
Can you tell this jury as you sit here today when that inflammation that you just referred to would have started?
This person would not have sustained severe burns for more than a couple of minutes without losing their ability to communicate.
Okay. And that would be based upon what?
Everything I viewed,
okay,
and my expert opinion and my experience with trauma cases.
And that was testimony from speech pathologist Dr. Higdon. Now, Judge Wolcott, do you think that this was effective expert testimony here? Do you think that she's persuaded any of the jurors?
Well, listen, as a judge, I rely on experts, and I believe juries rely on experts because they do generally know what they're talking about. Here's the thing I'm going to suggest. I've seen it all. Every time we think we've seen it all, we're surprised. Even though an expert says no way she could have talked, I believe, based on the testimony of those who responded initially, she could have talked. Even though an expert says, well, it's not possible, it easily could have happened.
Yes, I think that that's the difficulty in this entire case, is that the first responders were actually there. And the jurors are going to have to just reconcile how to take what the first responders are saying with what Dr. Higdon is saying. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Yoshio. And I'm sure they're going to, the expert's very credible and an expert in her field. So, of course, you believe what she's saying. But you have 4 witnesses who says she did talk. That's hard to refute.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here today, Judge Wolcott. Your expertise is absolutely invaluable, and we're going to be back after the break. Thank you. Welcome back to Law and Crime. We're following the Jessica Chambers murder trial, and we're about to hear from a woman, Sherry Flowers, who says she may have driven Quinton Tellis, the accused in this case, from the crime scene to another location. Let's take a listen to her testimony.
Approached the firehouse. Did you see anything?
I saw a person walking.
Okay. Let me back up. When you went to your house first, did you see anybody on the roadway?
No.
When you left your house and headed back to Michael McMurray's home, what did you see?
I saw a person walking.
And as you approached that person, how did they respond?
When I approached that person?
Sorry, did the person try to flag you down at all?
I think so.
You think so? Was the person by himself, by him or herself, or with somebody else?
The person was by himself.
It was a man?
It was a male.
And did you in fact stop at that person?
I did.
Why did you stop?
Because I thought it maybe was somebody related to me. Randre, I normally stop for Randre on that road. Randre said that's a cousin of mine.
So you had stopped for Randre before on that road?
I have.
Did this person approach your vehicle?
Yes.
What window did he approach your vehicle?
On the driver's side.
And what did you immediately notice when he approached your vehicle? And was it a African American or a Caucasian male?
Yes, an African American.
What type of build? Would you call him small, medium, or large?
Between small and medium.
And what about his hair? What about his head?
I couldn't see his hair. I mean, I think his head was covered.
And what type of shirt did he have on?
I don't remember.
Okay. Was he wearing a big coat?
No.
What type of voice did he have?
I can't describe his voice either, but I know it wasn't a deep voice.
And you didn't know this person, correct?
No.
At the time, the only thing you knew that he was Julia Chambers' nephew.
Right.
Did you, in fact, give him a ride up the hill?
Yes.
And where did you drop this individual off?
On Highway 51, across the street, not too far from Julia's house.
Right there at the entrance of Old Highway 51 and New Highway 51?
So you're hearing testimony from Sherry Flowers, who transported someone, maybe Quinton Tellis, from the crime scene to another location. Now, Jennifer, I want to talk about this testimony. How helpful do you think it is, Sherry Flowers' testimony, even though she doesn't definitively say that's Quinton Tellis? She's describing a man, but to me it sounds a little bit abstract. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you. I think it's a bit of a risk that the prosecution is calling this witness. They didn't call her in the first trial. As you said, she's lacking a lot of detail. Her memory is lacking here. And she can't identify Quinton Tellis with any reasonable degree of certainty here. And I think that can confuse the jury. I think the jury can say, well, we've got reasonable doubt when it comes to this hitchhiker. But the truth of the matter is that this whole hitchhiking episode could never have happened. In truth, but Quinton Tellis could in fact still be the perpetrator. And so I think it could confuse the jury and end up not being an effective strategy for the prosecution. Because
even the description that's given doesn't exactly match Quinton Tellis. She's saying small, medium build, a couple years younger than Quinton Tellis is. So I definitely agree with you that I think it's confusing. What I also want to talk about is there was a lot of confusion, at least at the beginning of her testimony, with the DA asking her questions, her being confused. Now, the district attorney is allowed to prepare their witnesses or allowed to speak with them beforehand. Do you think that happened here? And do you think if it didn't happen, should it have happened?
Gosh, it doesn't look like it happened here. But on the other hand, the prosecutor has an ethical obligation not to put words in the witness's mouth. And so he has to confront head on the fact that she may not have these details. And that's what it is. Even if he did prepare her, he has to deal with the fact, the reality, that her memory is just not that great here. To that end, he's limited. And that's why I think it's a big risk to call this witness.
Yes, I completely agree here. I think that they have a lot to lose. I think it really confuses the narrative, especially because Ms. Flowers can't definitively point the finger at Quinton Tellis here. So we're going to listen a little bit more to different testimony. It's going to be an FBI special agent, and he's going to talk about a little bit more about the Jessica Chambers case. Let's take a listen.
At the shed, did he show you anything else?
Yes.
And what did Quinton show you at the shed?
A 5-gallon gasoline can.
Okay. So he showed you a gasoline can in the shed in front of his house?
He did.
And did you finally, before you ended the interview, ask him about text messages that he had with Jessica?
Yes.
And what did he tell you he had done with the text messages?
Since her death, he had deleted them from his phone.
And did he tell you when he did that?
He did. I don't recall, other than the fact that we did ask about his motorcycle, the dirt bike, and he took us to show us the dirt bike. And while we're discussing the dirt bike, we asked him about the gas can, or he showed it to us and said that that was his gas can.
Sure. Well, you said the gas can was actually inside the shed. Mm-hmm. So were you inquiring as to the gas can, or did Mr. Tellis say, "Oh, I got a gas can sitting inside here. Would you like to look at it?" How did that take place?
I don't remember. I don't remember if the door to the shed was already open. I just can't remember every detail of it. I just remember seeing the motorcycle the dirt bike, at the shed, and seeing the gas can in the shed. I know we did look in the shed, and I don't recall if it was already opened or if he opened the door.
So that was testimony from an FBI special agent who actually interviewed Quinton Tellis. Now, Jennifer, I want to break this down because I think there's some interesting bits throughout this testimony. The first thing I want to discuss is the deletion of the text messages. How bad is that for Quinton Tellis? Is that just a natural reaction of someone who's nervous and perhaps innocent but just worried, or is that really strong indicator that Quinton Tellis is guilty and trying to cover something up? What are your thoughts?
It's bad news for Quinton Tellis. Deleting text messages from Jessica Chambers in the days after she's murdered, it doesn't look good. And we know, because we've seen this trial, that they do in fact recover those text messages from Jessica Chambers, and they're incredibly damaging for Quinton Tellis. So it is no coincidence that this young man ended up deleting those text messages from Jessica Chambers. Very damaging.
And you're saying those text messages are especially damaging because I believe he was asking her for sex, she was denying him, and do you think they're damaging because that essentially gives him a motive?
Well, sure, it looks like he was deleting them because he needed to cover that up. And why wouldn't he want to cover that up? Of course, if she denied him sex, that certainly would be a motive for this crime. He was one of the last people to see her alive. So it makes perfect sense to me that he would be deleting these text messages, and I can't imagine that that won't resonate with the jury.
Let's talk about the gas can next. We hear the FBI special agent talk about the discovery of a gas can. Now, how important do you think this is? Obviously, Jessica Chambers was burned alive. Gasoline was used, or some sort of accelerant was used in her death. How important is it, especially since I don't think it's made clear, at least from what we've heard so far, that there's necessarily a connection between the gas can and Jessica Chambers' car?
Right. So they're trying to establish some forensic evidence here with this gas can and with the text messages. But like you said, so he found some gas in a shed. You know, who doesn't have a gas can in their shed? But what's critical here is, will they be able to link that specific type of gas to the gasoline that was found on Jessica Chambers? So far, we haven't heard a testimony to that extent, but we'll just have to see how this unfolds.
And what about the dirt bike, the testimony about that? What are they trying to establish by eliciting that through the special agent?
You know, again, I think they're laying the groundwork for some forensic evidence here, whether it's going to be dirt that was similar to the dirt around the scene of the car, and therefore it's a forensic link in that fashion. But really, that's what the crux of this FBI agent's testimony is laying the groundwork for all these different forensic pieces of evidence. And that's really what the jury probably will really look for in this case.
Well, we're going to continue our coverage of the Jessica Chambers murder trial right after this break. Stay tuned. And that was Scott Meadows, the ATF agent, who said that Quinton Tellis' phone and Jessica Chambers' phone were at the same place. He was able to locate them using some new updated technology. Now, Jennifer, how effective do you think that testimony was? Because we hear he comes out and says it. The phones were in the same place. That seems to be really compelling evidence.
Well, sure it is. It absolutely is compelling forensic evidence. That, coupled with the fact that we know Quinton Tellis had lots of inconsistencies in his story. So when they nail him down with this forensic evidence, and then they can also show that he was lying, I mean, that really points to guilt. At least it could in the minds of the jurors. I think also this witness offers a lot of value in testifying about the Miranda waiver. So they very cleanly present that evidence that he was advised of his rights and he chose to waive those rights, and therefore this testimony is admissible.
So how does the defense attack this? Because as you are so rightly saying, it seems like a very legitimate interview with the Miranda rights, and the new technology that he's talking about seems compelling. So what options does the defense have here?
You know, I think one of the defense arguments can be that they were just circling and circling around Quinton Tellis, and after a while, Quinton Tellis is going to waffle. That's human nature. that if the cops follow you for long enough, they're eventually going to corner you and catch you in an inconsistency. It's inevitable if you're being questioned time and time again. But it will be interesting to see what the defense says here. I think the defense really needs to focus on the Eric and Derek statements, and I think that's really where they'll focus their defense.
Yes, that seems to be what's very strong for them. But next we have an interrogation video, really every criminal defense attorney's worst nightmare. Quinton Tellis is questioned by the police. His lawyer is not present. Let's see how that interrogation goes for Quinton and whether it's helpful or hurtful for his case. Let's take a listen.
But that was tight fit in that little big car. Okay. Well, and I'm not trying to pry, too much, but I mean, she's a good-looking girl. Yes, she was. Yeah, she really was. So you had to be attracted to her, and you hadn't been out of prison that long. How come? How come only one time?
I was trying to get her to give, but she told me her period was on, so she told me her period was on, so I told her to.
Well, that period didn't last a month and a half or so. So
period don't last no longer than like 4 or 5 weeks.
Okay. So what about before or after she came off her period? You didn't try it again?
About this time, I probably had Jamie in my house when Jamie had on too much.
What you're watching was an interrogation video of Quinton Tellis. As I said before we watched the video, every defense attorney's worst nightmare. You don't want your client speaking to the police without an attorney present. Now, Jennifer, my question for you is there any way or under any circumstance that Quinton Tellis should have spoken to the police in this situation?
Oh, gosh, no. He certainly should have asked for an attorney, but we know all too well that frequently defendants or would-be defendants talk to the police willingly, sometimes out of hubris, sometimes they just think they can outwit the police, sometimes they're just frankly not smart enough and think that they should just go ahead and talk, it will make me look less guilty. So for any number of reasons, they may decide to speak with investigators, and 9 times out of 10, it is the wrong decision.
And so what's really important about this interrogation video is there's so many inconsistencies, right? And so what does a defense do to explain away these inconsistencies? Do they have him testify?
Generally, no. I mean, putting the defendant on the stand is one of the most horrific mistakes you can make, because the defense doesn't have the burden of proof, the prosecution does, and they surely would be subjecting their client to a brutal cross-examination if he's going to take the stand. So it's not surprising at all that he doesn't take the stand, especially in light of all of these inconsistencies. It would be very difficult for him to survive a cross-examination and be subjected to those questions about those inconsistencies.
Yes, it seems like a cross-examination in this case would have been horrible for Quinton Tellis, trying to explain away all those inconsistencies. We're going to have more on the Jessica Chambers murder trial after this brief break. Stay tuned.
I need to tell the whole truth. It can still be what I am telling the truth. Give me just a second. Oh. Remember those burns on your arm? Remember those burns on the back? Mm-hmm. Remember that? Tell us about that again.
Well, we was all in the sandbox, and we had been drinking, and we had a fire burning the wood pellets, and that was like it was been that we couldn't jump over the fire. So I said I could jump over the fire, so I ran back to the barbecue grill, and I took off and jumped. I made it, but at the end, like, I just fell back in the fire, and they pulled me up.
What night was that? Can't remember what night that was.
And there you have it. More of this extremely damaging interrogation video. Damaging because there's so many inconsistencies, one of which is the alibi that Quinton Tellis gives. Quinton Tellis is saying that he was with a man he calls Big Mike that day. Couldn't have possibly done it, only to find out later Big Mike was in Nashville. So Jennifer, obviously these inconsistencies are very damaging, and we talked previously about the fact that it's not a good idea to have the defense have him testify. How else can the defense deal with these inconsistencies?
Well, I think they just need to focus their defense on their strengths. And the biggest strength of all is the fact that Jessica uttered this dying declaration saying that the person who did this to her was named either Eric or Derek. I think it's all about deflect, and just go back to that Eric and Derek theme here, because it's really tough to get around these inconsistencies. It's interesting to see the first clip of the interrogation where Quinton Tellis is relatively relaxed. But then in the second clip here, we're seeing the investigators really zero in on him and say, listen, we know you're lying. You've got to tell the truth. And all of a sudden he's squirming, literally squirming in his seat. And he looks like a guy who's guilty.
Yeah, the body language certainly changes, and the interrogation itself changes. I think in the first video, we are seeing a jovial, more lighthearted interrogation, and then in the second clip, tensions are rising on both sides. What I think is interesting is we don't always get these videotaped sessions within, the police office walls. How do you think that changes this case versus if we never were able to see a video?
Well, even though the defendant isn't technically testifying, he effectively is. I mean, the jurors are hearing from him firsthand. And so that very much, changes the case, because the defendant is speaking to the jurors. The jurors have an opportunity to observe him, observe his demeanor. And that ultimately, I think, will be very damaging in this case.
Yeah, I agree. I think this interrogation as a whole was very damaging for Quinton Tellis. But we have more of the Jessica Chambers murder trial, including a verdict, including closing arguments, right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We're continuing our coverage of the Jessica Chambers murder trial. We've heard a lot of testimony. We've heard the highlights of a lot of people talking about this case. And some of the testimony has been very strong for the prosecution, some of it strong for the defense. We've heard a lot about the Derek versus Eric. What did Jessica Chambers say before she died the very next day? Let's hear how all of this testimony is summarized in the closing arguments. Let's take a listen.
The problem is those not being big enough, not being fast enough, not being strong enough. Those are things that were facts. Those are things that were knowns. And as hard as I tried, those are things that were never going to change. She was unable to tell them. You heard the sounds they made, and Dr. Higdon says, yes, she could have made a sound, but not anything that you could try to understand. I think these first responders went out there, and they walked into a scene, and you heard them testify, and the way it sounds, that it was one talk to her, who did this to you, move along. One talk to her, who did this to you, move along. One talk to her. The fact is that Daniel Cole told you when he got to the scene, he reached down and wanted to know her name. She was so quiet he had to get down in her face, as Dr. Hickerson told you she would be. And she said, ah. Daniel Cole wanted to help. Daniel Cole didn't do anything wrong. He's trying. And he turned around and told them, I think I heard Eric. And it spread like wildfire out there.
That was the prosecution's closing. Now let's hear from the defense.
Do you remember what I told you Tuesday morning? As I got started, I said, the evidence will show that on Saturday, December 6, 2014, nearly 4 years ago, I said that Miss Jessica walked and she talked. And she didn't try. She told them who did this to her. She also said her name. She said Jessica. Some points she said Chambers. She said, he set me on fire. Eric set me on fire. And what I found, and what I know you found as well, is that you could hear. In the midst of all of that noise, there were several trucks that were running. You could still hear. And it was much like it was quieter down there at that level, listening to her.
You just heard the closing statement from the defense in the Jessica Chambers murder trial. Now, Jennifer, I want to go back to the prosecution and talk a little bit about the things that they did well. In that short clip, I thought that he really learned from the mistrial in the their first mistrial by focusing very hard on their expert witness, discussing how she possibly couldn't have said Derek or Eric. Do you think that that was a smart decision?
Yes, I think it was essential that they called this speech pathologist who did not testify in the first trial. But I think, overall, at least when it comes to this issue of the dying declaration, the defense wins because there is, at a minimum, reasonable doubt, at least reasonable doubt in the minds of some of the jurors. It's a very tough issue to overcome. But when you look at the totality of the circumstances and all of the evidence, and we haven't heard about that in the closing arguments at this point, I think when it comes to the totality of all of the evidence, the prosecution has a much stronger case.
I agree. I think the defense definitely wins on that point, and I think they had a very strong closing, talking about the words that she was able to say, including her own name. But we have more coming up, including the verdict in the Jessica Chambers murder trial. Let's take a listen.
Ms. Morrow, I've got a note from you all that looks like y'all don't feel like y'all are going to be able to reach a decision in this case. Is that the feeling of the jury? Members of the jury, is that you feel you agree with Ms. Morrow? And is anyone that does not agree with that? So, all right. So. You've worked very hard, and I appreciate it. 12 hours is a long time to deliberate. Really, you've almost say you've been in deliberation for 24 hours. And I wish that you had been able to reach a verdict. I think you wish you'd been able to reach a verdict. I know you've been very attentive to the evidence. I know you've taken your job seriously.
So there you have it. There is a mistrial, the second mistrial. Jurors unable to unanimously find Quinton Tellis guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, briefly, Jennifer, were you surprised by this verdict, or mistrial, rather?
Frankly, I was. I thought there would be a conviction here, but it certainly is understandable given there was the mistrial in the first case. I mean, it's not uncommon for there to be a second mistrial. Yes, the prosecution had essentially a second bite at the apple, an opportunity to do things better. I think they did do things better, but it just evidently wasn't enough.
Yeah, I agree. This was, who knows if there's going to be a third case and a third trial. But Jennifer Schuster, I want to thank you so much for being here. Your intake and input were invaluable. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Next, we have the Chris Watts sentencing hearing. It's something you're not going to want to miss. Chris Watts was a Colorado man who was accused and then admitted to killing his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. It was horrific, but he didn't plead guilty immediately. He went on national television to beg for the return of his family. He later confessed days later. Let's hear from the sentencing hearing after this break. Stay tuned.